along, and enough people that they knew to be able to walk the street and say hello and enter into conversation and ask how the new baby was and so on. And that world is dissipating rapidly. It's an enormous shift. So we already have a problem with talking about the church in the community, because we're not quite sure any longer that we have an actual lived experience of an awful lot that is around us. An awful lot that's around us now is alien and strange. And so we have a really bizarre phenomenon, not bizarre. We've got a social phenomenon that has changed on two fronts. Firstly, the role of the church is not the same. The role of the church as a symbol of some kind of solidarity and some kind of communitarian experience is over. It's not just a question of it's declining. It's been declining for a long, long time. But when it reached a certain point, the decline was considerable. And we now have that incredible phenomenon in the area I live in. It's writ large in a couple of congregations where two dying churches in the area. I live in the village in South Belfast, a loyalist community in South Belfast, and which is sort of starts really from Sandy Row and works its way down into Donegal Avenue, down the Donegal Road. And it's a very particular community. And there are people in struggling churches there who come as far away as Bangor to go to one of those struggling, potentially dying churches in that inner city community. So to talk about community is really difficult for the church, because we mightn't even have church communities any longer in the sense of geographical space and in the sense of the regular attendance of people who could walk there, and very definitely in the sense of the lost memory of, my grandmother was baptized there, and my mother was baptized there, and my father, we went to church, and there was an inheritance of memory that was in the church community, which is fast dissipating. And as congregations get smaller and many congregations become unviable economically, and some of you may well have been through the very painful experience of having to see a church shut down or having to amalgamate with a Methodist or something. I mean, that would traumatize anybody. But, there's this sense in which we have this change within us as faith communities that is epic. And it took a long time in coming, but when it arrived, it's a bit like a wave, a bit like a tsunami. It can take a while coming, but when it arrives, the consequences can be overwhelming and profoundly disorientating. And that's certainly where we find ourselves now in the church community. And then, if we talk about community, we have this other reality that we call the community, and that's something out there that is the non-church going neighbors, friends, and what have you, areas and so on, which we, in the broad sense of the word, might call the community. But you won't have missed the fact that wider thing called the community has changed beyond belief as well. And that will accelerate over the next decade. And that change is something to do with who are these people that are my neighbors now. And depending on where you are, it could be a mild shift of something that's just a little bit in the air, or it can be, where I am, a profound shift. In an inner city, working class, what used to be a predominantly loyalist area, and a community that had a deep sense of neighborliness. All of that is disappearing from where I live with great acceleration and a real sense of disorientation. for the Indigenous community, which is fundamentally a working class Protestant loyalist community. I'm there for a number of particular reasons. I'm there for a long time, and I have great admiration for that loyalist community. I am not a loyalist. I do not represent in any way some of the political ideas that come out of that community and so on. But I recognize in that community a kind of symbol of the acceleration of change and the trauma and disorientation that it can bring about. I also admire that community amazingly, because we tend to hear about and think of loyalist working class communities as fascist and racist and fundamentally intolerant of anything that threatens them in any shape or form. It's not true. So just jump on it. The community that I live in is one of the most tolerant inner city, working class, loyalist communities that you could imagine. Their welcoming of the stranger, their toleration of the multiculturalism, not to mention those real monsters of life, students, their ability to have welcome and accepted and sought to manage and relate to a paradigm shift in their world of unbelievable proportion. That same generosity would not have been there just across the railway bridge from us up into the posh houses of South Belfast. Those communities would not have welcomed the shift that is taking place in that inner city working class with the same kindness and generosity. Yes, no swastika has appeared. There were, there's a particular targeted group, the sort of Roma, Romanian, for some reason. Many people in that area can accept everybody, but they haven't quite worked out what the dynamic is or what the trigger for that actually is, but it's an interesting phenomenon in itself. But there's been a shift there that in theory should have been traumatic to the point of possible some serious racist reaction, but it hasn't. And it's not there. So I tell those two narratives because there's a sense if we are to talk about how do we relate to a community, and in what way do we help support particularly struggling, whether that's economic or cultural or identity issues within communities. If we're to take our role as Christians seriously, particularly towards those that are in the category of the blessed or the economically poor, and if in that category we are to take that seriously, then we have to understand the complex sociological dynamics and changes that have accelerated overnight and created very different worlds, very different spaces that we were used to. So on the one hand, our society is changing and it's becoming complicated. And on the other hand, the church and its idea of change and its solidarity around a particular meeting place and so on has changed considerably as well. And an awful lot of life is in flux. And it's very disturbing. And the older you get, my age, the more disturbed you are. By definition, the older you get, the more you want things to be the same and reliable and predictable. The last thing I want in my, so I'm What age am I? I'm now
65?
I'm now 68. I'm 68 years old.
At least they are.
And the older I get, the more I want predictability. And the Holy Spirit doesn't seem to tolerate that an awful lot, because the Holy Spirit seems to be willing to do things and nudge you and push you and guide you and challenge you in ways that you go, I'm too old for that. I really could do with sitting beside streams of water somewhere and having a calm, blissful experience of the last years of my life. But it's not what's happening. I don't want to be at the front line of these dynamic shifts that are taking place. And they're profound shifts that are taking place in the world. But if I stay Christian, I have no choice. I have to stay in tune with what's going on around us, i.e. the signs of the times, what's going on in our world, and stay tuned to what the Holy Spirit wants God's people to be at a time like this. I would love to be able to tell you I know the answer to that. I don't. But I do know that remaining faithful and remaining open and at least staying young in spirit is part of that. It's part of that call. So we are at a time of challenge, and we're at a time of challenge when quite frankly the dynamics of where and how people live have changed considerably in terms of upward mobility. So if we're thinking that there is a role, which there is, for the church to consider the communities that are most disaffected, most socio and economically struggling, most alienated from the common good of a broader society. And we are quick to go for Republican communities and loyalist communities as symbols of that, which they are, but not exclusively. There are many other communities who live in very struggling socio-economic situations, who are locked into not just geographical spaces, but they're locked into ways of doing life and ways of thinking about life. They're locked sometimes into long-term and intergenerational employment issues, failure in education, and so on. And all of that is continuing to happen while, by and large, churches find themselves in an upward mobility mode. That is, we seek to live by constantly doing better in our lives economically, by constantly improving our income, by constantly improving the homes that we have, etc., etc. And what happens with those, and I'm not condemning these, legitimate manifestations of socio-economic betterment, is that we tend to move up and move out. That's essentially what we do. Matter of fact, that was one of the things that scuppered the Wesleyan work when Charles Wesley was actually establishing Methodism in Ireland, and also in England, of course, as well. He discovered that the very faith that he had brought to the poor actually created upward mobility. And when you got upward mobility, you moved up and you moved out. For good reason, for your children. That's what we do it for. Well, maybe for ourselves as well. Or maybe to get space to get the second car. We move up and we move out. That's what we do. But in doing that, we find that, in fact, the church becomes bourgeois. The church becomes alienated. And then something really strange happens. When we talk about engaging with the community, what we really are talking about is dipping into some of these communities rather than living in. those communities and being present, being a resource, being a witness, being whatever the unique and special thing that God might call us or a group of people to be. And we're now seeing that actually writ large in our church buildings as well. Much of it because of economic struggling, trying to pay bills and, you know, keep that big, you know, Victorian Edwardian building warm and whatever. And that's, again, not viable. And the pain that many people are suffering about, you know, churches being closed. And, I mean, I had the facility at a very long standing church and facility at the ending of our church. It's heartbreaking for people, particularly older people, you know, who know intergenerational baptism there, and coming to faith, and going through all the rites of passage that give them a deep sense of purpose, sense of belonging, and so on. All of a sudden, the doors in this place is closing. I mean, nothing short of biblical lament is needed for such losses. You know, I mean, it's a massive loss and runs deep and profound because it's intergenerational. It has a collective memory that people and families carry with them. But it's also the loss of all that saintly wisdom and witness that was there that has now disappeared as well. So we're in a crisis around our buildings. And one of the things that our denominations have just decided to do, started way back in the 80s, but it's, you know, beginning to accelerate, is basically sell all the church properties in the city. You know, to basically, you know, disentangle ourselves by and large from many of the properties within the hinterland, certainly within the city centre. I'm thinking of Belfast, and I'll come to regional situations in a minute. But in, you know, we have this real sense that we can't afford things, so we need to sell the YMCA and sell, you know, that building there where, you know, 20 people come on a Sunday and what have you, and often some of the mission buildings and so on, because property goes up, we can make a pile of money and so on. We can do all of that, but in fact we are abandoning the city to a large degree. And in the long term, when the city might actually need our presence the most, we won't be there. And I say that because whoever controls the city controls the culture of the nation. So whoever controls the city has profound influence on the nation's values, on its culture. So Belfast City Council have a vision at the minute is to turn Belfast into a university city. And if you look at what happens to the change in values, the change in ideas, the change in relationships, what takes place in university cities, you can guarantee faith will be under tremendous pressure to be pushed out. And where does it get pushed out to? It's pushed out into the hinterland of small towns, or out into the suburbs, where in fact we then build new churches for new families and so on. But in a strange way, we find ourselves actually on the periphery of the cultural life of the nation. And we find ourselves not necessarily intending this, but we find ourselves in defense mode. You know, we're in a defensive mode, and we just hope to some degree, well, maybe the city will go to hell in a basket, and, you know, we will be there to be able to somehow or another maintain our situation. And often that strategy is successful, but it has deep problems about being too middle class, too comfortable, too safe, too threatened by that which is now ugly in the city, is now profoundly anti-faith, profoundly, you know, antagonistic towards all things Christian, and we find ourselves on the margins, not able to know what it would look like to engage with the community, what might be necessary to actually do that. Now, that's an epic subject, and there's just so many components to that. But it's where we're now where we are both practically and theologically at, there's a paradigm shift that's taking place. And it happened overnight, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It happened and we didn't hardly notice it. And the change is epic. And there's a great example of it, and it's the church. What's the young people's church I was going to there for a number of weeks?
May Street?
Just May Street. But I went to see what was happening in May Street Presbyterian Church, which was abandoned and left, and it was basically, the building was beginning to deteriorate. Actually, I saw the inside of the building before what happened. And it was abandoned, that incredible building, and left empty. And 4 young people, I think it was a couple of young women, a couple of young men, asked the Presbyterian Church, could they take a look at it? When they were there looking at it, all kinds of things were decaying, and the building was going to decline. You know, it's like when you empty a building, it has a way of accelerating its decay, and so on. And they did, and I make no judgment of the Presbyterian Church here, but I do want to make a juxtaposition, and that is 4 young people and a handful of their friends basically decided we'll move into that building. When the Presbyterian Church moved out, we will move into that inner city, and we will ask the question, what would it look like for us to do church again in Central, in this church, in May Street? What would that look like? I was there on Sunday morning. There were about 70 young people in the church, and about another maybe 20 or 30 doing Zoom. Many of them were the new mothers and fathers were babies that were still staying at home. And they moved into the city centre because they understood there is a real community, an inner city community that live and breathe within that space to perhaps begin to dip into and to ask what would it look like to engage with these new and multiple communities that are emerging in the inner city. Because we are in for Babel in the cities. The cities are going to become Babel. They're going to be really multiple identities, you know, in competition with each other in multiple ways, multiple identities that will have everything and nothing in common. What they'll have in common is the city. So this young church has decided to do something else. So the issue is, how do we engage then in these other communities that begin to exist, that emerge not in the city directly, but in the suburbs, then out into the towns, and will eventually bring ideas and values to the very countryside itself. So that's something of the change that is happening, and it's enormous. It's more than we know, and it has only started. It's going to be profoundly disorientating. It's going to need us to have 2 wonderful things. One is a depth of faith, a righteous and prayerful life, and it's going to need us to be able to do a theology of change. What does it look like to be Christian, to live Christianly in a time and a place like this? And that for a 68-year-old is something I could do without. And the other people in the room would be something you could do without too. And yet we're called to a time like this. So, what does it look like to engage with the community? I think one of the first things that it looks like is the recognition that we might actually be estranged in all kinds of ways from the kinds of needy communities that we would want to genuinely help. There is a very real sense in which the Beatitudes are the manifesto of the kingdom of God, and stuck right in the middle of those Beatitudes, in fact, is this care for the poor. And indeed, right through both Old and New Testament, there is an invitation, not as the complete ministry and witness of the church by any means, but as part of our compassion and part of our social justice and part of the kingdom of God's desire to actually be present in communities where lives are harmed, where young people do not get opportunity and destinies are set just because of the environment in which they live. We could say so much more about that as part of our Christian theology, and certainly as part of our Christian witness. I think it was Ernest, one of the church fathers, who said, the glory of God is humanity fully alive. God glorifies in well children. God glorifies in communities that are safe, in communities that flourish, in communities that thrive, to use the name of our organization, in communities that actually have vision and purpose and a deep sense of well-being that somehow or another is rooted in a society of justice. And so we as Christians have at some measure, a vocation into those spaces. And the question is, how do we do that? And the answer is, I don't know, to a large degree. Because we can't just be parachuted in. Because when we're parachuted in, we're trying to influence communities, but we don't have a proper relationship. And communities don't listen when there isn't a relationship. So the building of relationships is part of our challenge. The most obvious missional form about how we might engage with struggling communities is to live there. That's the most obvious one. But the whole of our church culture is disorientated in a different direction. We're up and out. We don't want to live in some of those situations, and that is not a condemnation by any stretch of the imagination. If you've got young children and you're a half-decent parent, you're going, no way am I bringing my children into that space. You know, that would be a responsible thing to do. And I've got friends who have done that and have chosen to do that. So one of the fundamental discipleship issues as to how do we engage, one of the most fundamental ones is that we go and we live there. We actually do the incarnation. The incarnation is, as you know, that Christ lived among us. It literally means that wonderful thing in John's Gospel, John's Gospel, where he came and he lived among us, literally translates as he built his tent among us. He put up his tent in our space. And we might need to be considering into the future how we nurture particular people who have a real sense of vocation into how they might locate into difficult situations, how they might be homebred missionaries, how they might be a profound presence in difficult circumstances, how they might learn how to connect and witness to and be present for people in those situations. I have to say, to the credit of the Catholic Church, they have a history of that. Partly, that was one of the motivations behind celibacy. One of the many motivations behind Catholic celibacy was so that the missionary priest could in fact not worry about the children. It's not the only thing by any means, but it was the idea that this man or this woman, these people coming out of monastic communities and so on, could actually place themselves in situations of difficulty and challenge and even physical risk, you know, in many companies. They could place themselves as witnesses of Christ in those environments, and so on. So for us, the challenge is, and I'm not, please do not hear this as being directed at you, this is just generic and general. Our challenge might be, how do we nurture in our churches the possibility of people who could see that as a vocation, as something that they could consider doing. The second thing is, how do we actually, in some sense, relate and overlap in those communities, so that if some of those communities sort of edge up to where our church is. I remember being invited once to, I'll not give you the name, but I was invited to a very big and prosperous church that invited me to help them look at where they might be able to witness, you know, in what they thought was a fairly barren landscape. When I was driving up to the church, I noticed there was a loyalist housing estate that literally backed up to the church parking space. Literally, there's this loyalist housing estate, just comes up, and then here's the church's parking space, and then, you know, and then there's the church. So when I went into the church leadership, and we began to talk about, you know, how we might look at some things, about mission and so on for that congregation, I asked them, you know, the loyalist housing estate, how many people from there go to the church? None. How many people from the church live there? None. What kind of children's program or outreach program or connectivity do you have with that housing? None. Completely and utterly. And those very questions should the elders of that church, because those questions have never entered their head. But what had entered their head was a genuine and sincere desire for some kind of outreach program. But there was this kind of blindness or something that just didn't facilitate a kind of righteous imagination of what might it look like. But when we talked deeper, what was really interesting was the people in the congregation, and certainly the leadership, thought, we don't have what's needed to be able to enter into that space. We are unbelievably middle class. We don't know how to do this. And so, and Dan was, it was Dan as he taught me this way, but we talked about doing community audits. We talked about finding creative ways to get children to come to some of the children's activities. We talked just simply about ways in which that congregation could make connection. And that was the easy bit. Because the hard bit was, once they did build trust, make connection, do some wonderful things, the hard bit was the class difference that was going on within that particular context. And one of the class differences was that when the church began to relate into that situation, the church, the Christians who moved into that situation, never moved into it, but moved in to do different programs, actually began to dominate and control all the activities that went on within that space. I'm telling you this for this reason. One of the important things about how we engage with communities is somehow or another to do with being able to dignify what is already good within that space, and to be able to nurture it, to be able to recognize, and this is true particularly of women, how much genius there already is in that community, how much experience insight, ability that actually exists within that community. And so I'm saying that because the first step towards how we might engage with and listen to the community, the first step is a reprogramming of ourselves. A whole new and different way of finding out who is here and who are they and what are they already doing. Because to our surprise, when we've done this in the past, we've been amazed by what some people in the most appalling socioeconomic situations, what some people have been able to achieve with so little. And the acumen and ability, again, particularly women, that actually in those, because they love their children, the ability in people's communities, but that what they needed was resources, and what they needed was to be listened to, and what they needed were people often who could advocate for them. So we would call that advocacy work, which is a discipline in itself, and could actually acknowledge, support, recognize what was taking place there, and help that thing grow. It was already planted, but to find ways to help it grow.
Yes.
Yeah,
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So the challenge for how we engage with communities, particularly with communities that are struggling, the challenge is, how do we understand them? Because the alienation is enormous. So I'm going to go back to my situation. We work with a wonderful church leader who works on the Sandy Road and works down into my part of the world, which is Donegal Avenue, and he works into that space. And this man is nothing short of saintly and gifted, because his attitude and his understanding of the people that he is working with is one of profound dignity towards who these people are, an unbelievable ability in the messiness and the stuckness at times, and the use of language, and the issues of sex, and the issues of dysfunctionality, and the issues of young people being failed by the education system. I mean, all of the issues that you imagine are part of an abandoned, dysfunctional inner city environment. He walks through that space with love and respect, and has an ability, particularly with the young people, to actually understand it. One of the reasons for that is that he was once one of those, and now he's an ordained minister with a great theological mind, a wonderful passion for those on the margins, and a particular care for the next generation. And very quickly, his approach to them is incredibly simple. The first one is, they are made in the image of God, and their dignity and their worth is held in the heart of God every day of their lives. That's his first approach towards them. And he puts me to shame in some of that, because I get irritated in the space when it looks like he doesn't. The second thing is Dan's title, Listening, He Listens. He doesn't just listen, but he expects to learn from his listening. He absolutely expects to learn. Thirdly, he advocates on their behalf. Basically, he is a representative for them, for the good, towards politicians, towards how money is distributed, particularly towards the demonization of those communities. And I understand that I've been in high places and I've heard people who should have known better, both in government, in the Community Relations Council, in all kinds of business circles. And I've heard them talk about loyalist communities in the most appalling way. As if these people are Neanderthals. As if there's nothing whatsoever about these communities. So the other thing with new models that is part of our challenge is basically how do we actually engage with dignity? How do we learn to listen? How do we advocate on their behalf? And how do we be a presence that is non-judgmental in a world that could do with serious change in so many aspects of their lives, but is non-judgmental in a way that paradoxically gives authority to being able to identify and name those things that are struggling. So, how do we listen to communities in the context of all that we've talked about with great difficulty? With great difficulty. And it's nothing short of a vocation. And if we have people in our churches who have it, then let's encourage them, train them, give them resources, help them do that, hold them, and be supportive through the hard times, and which inevitably come. And also let's find ways in which we can do it in a mutuality. That is, we have something to bring and those communities have something to give us. That'll do for now.
Thank you, Derek. So there is a wee cup of tea or coffee. Can I say thank you very much for filling in the evaluation form. This programme is funded by the Executive Office T-Book, which is Together Building United Community Fund. And therefore they expect us to provide monitoring and evaluation. You're given a unique number. So if your number, for example, is 71, could you remember that? Because if you come to more than one of these, you'll fill in one at the end to say what you thought of the whole thing. Now, we do have a record of what your number is, which we will destroy at the end of the programme. If you come to some of the other events, like we were at St. Patrick's last week, that's an event, so there's a different form for that. So anyway, if you could bring your tea or coffee back, Karen, could you help with that? And put the kettle on as well, because I don't think there's going to be enough hot water. And bring it back. We hope to start in 10 minutes again. So thank you so much.
And then we're just you're going to ask questions.